There's a specific kind of cultural failure that's almost more interesting than success. Not the kind where a movie is bad and everyone agrees, but the kind where something genuinely original crashes and burns in the moment, only to be loved and considered a cult classic years later. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is that kind of failure.
In the early days of something, when something comes out and it doesn't necessarily make a lot of money, I don't think you're really thinking, well, one day it'll be a cult phenomenon. You're just kind of like, oh, well.
I said, I know, because most of my favorite films were like, flops on the initial release.
And 15 years later, it might be one of the most important films of its decade, but during that time, there wasn't a single soul saying that. Before the film existed, the source material had already built something rare, a genuinely passionate following around a story that shouldn't have worked on paper. Brian Lee O'Malley's graphic novel series, which began in 2004, followed a 22-year-old slacker bassist in Toronto who had to fight his new girlfriend's 7 evil exes in increasingly crazier fight sequences that looked like they were lifted straight from a video game. It was part comic book, part anime, and entirely its own thing. Universal acquired the rights to the graphic novel series when the first volume was published in 2004, and the studio set their eyes on Edgar Wright, who had just directed Shaun of the Dead, signing him onto the project. Wright was a natural fit. He'd built his reputation on making films that had a specific editing style and tons of visual comedy. Stories that rewarded people who paid close attention, but Scott Pilgrim was a different beast. It wasn't just a story to be told, it was an entire aesthetic to be translated to the masses. Wright wanted to use the imagery directly from the books, including real Toronto locations that O'Malley had used as photo references for the comic, and the result was a film that felt rooted in a specific type of subculture. Michael Cera spent around 9 months on set and later recalled having so much fun that he was depressed when production wrapped.
But I was there for, I think, 9 months or something, which is like an enormous amount of time to work on something. But it was so much fun all the time because we just had the greatest vibe with everybody. I think that basically trickled down from Edgar and the energy that he was creating. And we all got to rehearse together and spend a lot of time together.
Something he attributed to Wright's energy setting the tone from the beginning. And the cast around him was remarkable, even if most of the world didn't know it yet. Kieran Culkin, Anna Kendrick, Aubrey Plaza, Brie Larson, and a pre-Captain America Chris Evans, each of them in a very early stage of their careers. Michael Cera even suffered a concussion during a fight scene with Evans, where a skateboard made of balsa wood repeatedly failed to break on impact and had to be reshot over and over again in freezing temperatures through the night. That kind of dedication was all over the film. The band members spent weeks learning to play together as an actual group. Wright personally wrote a letter to Nintendo requesting permission to use the Legend of Zelda theme, describing it as the nursery rhyme of a generation. Every little detail was considered. What the studio got back was something that had never quite existed before. By the summer of 2010, Universal was very confident in what they had. They gave Scott Pilgrim the red carpet treatment, including a massive showing at San Diego Comic-Con, where the general response from the audience was enthusiastic. There was even a video game tie-in that would go on to build a fan base of its own and outlive the film's theatrical run. Universal dated Scott Pilgrim for August 13, 2010, and it opened against The Expendables and Eat, Pray, Love. In hindsight, this was a disaster. The Expendables had Sylvester Stallone, Jason Statham, Jet Li, and Dolph Lundgren. Eat, Pray, Love had Julia Roberts. Scott Pilgrim had Michael Cera fighting a guy who got his superpowers through veganism.
Being vegan just makes you better than most people.
Bingo.
The Expendables took the top spot with $34.8 million that weekend. Scott Pilgrim came in 5th with just $10.6 million, below even Inception, which was already on its 5th weekend of release. The following week, it nearly fell out of the top 10 entirely. Edgar Wright described getting an email on the Friday of the first opening weekend from producer Mark Platt predicting its failure, and having thought that it was only Friday morning, so he still had a lot of hope on its success. He couldn't have been more wrong. The film bombed out of theaters with $31.5 million domestically and a disappointing $8.4 million from the UK before being dumped in most international markets. Against a production budget somewhere between $60 and $85 million, they failed to break even, and it wasn't remotely close. But there was another conversation happening at the same time, and it centered almost entirely on the film's lead. By 2010, Michael Cera had become a specific kind of cultural punchline. After Superbad, Juno, and a string of films where he played variations of the same stammering, soft-spoken, self-deprecating kid, the backlash had been building for years. The media at the time ran pieces with headlines like, "Michael Cera couldn't open an envelope," and critics noted openly that he was playing the same character in every single movie. When the trailers for Scott Pilgrim arrived, leaning heavily into his more subdued moments, it only confirmed the narrative. The trailers heavily featured Scott's meeker moments while omitting his more outwardly jerkish ones, doing little to dispel the perception that Cera was simply playing his usual meek hipster character again. For audiences already tired of that character type, Scott Pilgrim looked like more of the same, and they weren't entirely wrong either. Cera's performance in the film was subdued and awkward, where the source material's Scott was outgoing and hyperactively irresponsible. A different kind of dork entirely, one whose obliviousness came with a certain swagger the film never quite captured. Many people who loved the books felt the casting softened the character in ways that dulled the story's sharper edges. But in my opinion, the discomfort was partially the point. He's dating a 17-year-old to avoid processing his last breakup. The film is fundamentally about a character wrestling unhappily with memory and sending himself into a state of emotional stasis that keeps him from becoming his best self. The fights with the evil exes are just the external form of an interior problem that Scott keeps refusing to deal with. Cera's particular brand of passive obliviousness served that arc, whether audiences recognized it or not. But the deeper structural problem wasn't Cera. It was that the film was built for an audience that didn't yet have the cultural vocabulary for what it was doing. The film's emphasis on the problems of millennial 20-something-year-olds alienated everyone older than the youngest Gen Xers, while the allusions to video games and pop culture from the late 1980s and early 1990s pushed away the group born in the late 1990s who were too young to have any memory of those references. It was caught in a generational gap. The marketing went all in on a fan-first approach centered on the geek community, which made the film feel inaccessible to the general public. Exactly the opposite of how properties like the MCU or Game of Thrones had managed to turn niche obsessions into mass events. Scott Pilgrim never threaded that needle. And yet, the people who did see it and enjoy it came out of theaters talking about it in a way that's hard to manufacture. About 3 months after the film's release, one critic was already using the phrase cult classic to describe it, noting simply that the people who liked the movie really liked it. The DVD and Blu-ray release that November was packed with 4 separate audio commentaries, deleted scenes, and an alternate ending. Pop culture fanatics recognized how masterfully Wright had blended together so many different elements, and the film's biggest advantage, the fact that there was nothing else quite like it, meant it maintained that quality over years in a way that more conventional films couldn't. The film's arrival on Netflix prompted the streaming service to bring Wright and O'Malley back to create a new anime adaptation, Scott Pilgrim Takes Off, featuring the entire original film cast reprising their roles. Cera, Winstead, Culkin, Plaza, Larson, Kendrick, Schwartzman, Evans speaks to something that doesn't happen with films people are embarrassed about.
That's why we're doing this animated series, and I've just never been a part of something where all Edgar had to do was say, "Hey, you guys want to do this?" And it was a race to jump in. Everyone, yes, of course, no brainer.
The cast of this movie is incredible, and we were all young and we were just having fun. I think experiencing something really rare and unique. I definitely think we all felt that.
Cera himself said he could have kept making Scott Pilgrim forever despite how exhausting the first movie was to make. Wright, reflecting on the film's 10th anniversary, said he was incredibly proud of the movie and pointed out, "The fact that you're not doing a 10th anniversary article about the Expendables says it all. He wasn't wrong. The film that crushed Scott Pilgrim on opening weekend is remembered today as a novelty. Scott Pilgrim is remembered as a masterpiece."